Hello, and welcome to Corruption Chronicles, the true crime story of everyday people who find corruption in their communities and how they turn it to good governance. I'm former Mayor Debbie Peterson, your host.
Today we have a guest who has quite a unique situation, and I would strongly encourage you to read her book because that will give you a wonderful background on it, and we'll go into that a little bit more later. Her name is Regina Griego. Regina has a PhD. She has retired from a distinguished career as an engineer, and she's now a coach, author, and speaker. She won a first place national award from the National Federation of Press Women for her first memoir, an Amazon bestseller, Sins of the System, Trauma, Guns, Tragedy, and the Betrayal of Our Children. Regina was born and raised in New Mexico, and her Hispanic roots go back 400 years. And she also has Native American roots. She's married with 6 children in a blended family and has 7 grandchildren. Regina has mentored many people as professor, senior engineer, and leadership coach. She's an activist for gun safety and juvenile justice, and a Georgetown-trained coach and fellow of the largest international systems engineering professional organization. She remains active in that organization, primarily mentoring and working with young people. She holds a PhD, MS, and BS in electrical and computer engineering and an MS in computer science. Regina, welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today. I started reading your book about 2 weeks ago, and for 3 days, I did pretty much nothing but read it. It was fascinating. Can you give us just a little bit of background on what we're going to talk about today and how you came to your huge journey that you've been on?
In January of 2013, we had a surprise phone call, 1:30 in the morning, by my niece in California. And she asked me if my brother and the family was dead. And she had seen something on Facebook, and we finally figured out that, yeah, indeed, my brother was dead, his wife, my sister-in-law, and 2 nieces and a nephew. And then later we figured out that, or through the course of that evening, that my nephew, who was 15 years old, had done it. I was in shock, obviously, and our family was devastated. My first instinct was something went wrong with this young man's brain. He wasn't ever in trouble with the law. He didn't have addictions. In fact, he was tightly controlled by his father. His father was a pastor in the largest evangelical church in Albuquerque and had just lost his job some 10 months beforehand. And so I knew something odd had gone on. And in the middle of the grief, I reached out to my nephew and became his guardian. And that's where my journey began. So that's the story. Now, we were a close family, but there was some stuff going on that we obviously didn't know. We knew that they were homeschooling their children, which it turns out they hadn't really homeschooled their son. They stopped at 3rd grade. And basically it was church and home. And then at family functions, the children weren't allowed to wander or anything like that. So, and I knew that my brother had been through a good bit of trauma as a child. And that's one of the things about the book that I'm trying to get across is these things do not happen in a vacuum. It's not like they, coming out of the blue. My brother was practicing some behaviors with his children that led to a perfect storm.
You mentioned that it seemed like something had gone wrong with his brain. And did you ever end up finding out what had gone wrong with his brain?
They diagnosed him with a trauma-induced schizoaffective disorder with severe depression. And it's because he was very isolated. He didn't go to school. His father beat him. In fact, he knocked him unconscious at age 11. And as a result of that, we found later that he had the brain of a 13-year-old at the time that he did the murders. And he had traumatic brain injury. He had been seeing hallucinations, both audio and visual hallucinations, since he was about 11, 12 years old. And he wouldn't tell his dad because his dad was very sure that these psychotherapy and that was cult-ish. And so he thought his dad would say he had demons. And so that whole thing went undiagnosed for years. And it just seemed to culminate And the doctor said it was the kind of hallucinations he had were command hallucinations where they're commanding you. And in his case, it became a mission that this hallucination was telling him, you have to do this, you have to do this. And basically, he just became split, schizoaffective disorder.
It's like he was in a terrible, terrible situation. And you go into the details on that in the book. And it's as if his brain was giving him orders to get out of it almost. And of course, I can't diagnose these things, but it seems like that's what was going on. He was trying to find a way out in an undeveloped, almost pre-adolescent brain, child's brain.
Right. The home environment was very characteristic, as I learned later, of these kind of situations. They're called parricide, where you kill family members. And it's usually the case where they're isolated, they're abused, and they're depressed, and they're in this situation that they feel like there's no way out. And he was terrified of his father. So that's one of the reasons why in fact, he tried to run away a couple of times, but his father obviously didn't receive that well. He basically beat him up pretty good. So he just felt like he was in a no-win situation, and this was his way out. In his brain, he conceived of this plan because he didn't know any other way out. And unfortunately, the children, had he not killed them, which is hard for me to even say or think about, but would have alerted his father, because his father was the last one to be killed after he came home from a job. The first 4 victims, which was my sister-in-law and 3 children, he was deep in this schizoaffective with this command hallucination in his head.
You can almost understand that really for him, there was no way out. You can understand. Right. I mean, obviously you can say to kids, talk to someone you trust, but he's going to go to the church, and his father had been a minister there. And so where would anyone listen to him? We don't know. And he certainly probably didn't have a lot of confidence in that. And so that makes sense when you explain it like that. And how did he have access to guns? To kill? How on earth did he know how to use a gun at the age of 16 to kill his family?
Well, that's the other part. Is my brother, was one of those that believed that he was going to have to take on the U.S. government. So he had an arsenal of 8 weapons, 2 AR-15s, and he trained his son to use all of them. In fact, he was training his son basically to be a soldier. He had him patrol the property every night and every morning. Well, actually through the night. And then he had him wear combat boots and a backpack, run with him, that kind of thing. He just really was a child soldier, in essence. He referred to his father as the general or the commander. He had reached the rank of sergeant by the time he was 15 years old. And so this was the relationship his father had with him. It was very odd.
And so he had basically almost no education. He'd suffered isolation and abuse, and he was depressed. His brain was at about the 13-year-old level. I should have said long ago, I'm sorry. I know it happened a long time ago, but I can tell that it still hurts, and it hurts to think about it. And I'm sure it's hard for even our listeners to think about. And so I really appreciate you sharing it in your book. And it helped me personally, because my first reaction was possibly like that of many people who aren't familiar, who've never had to face anything like this. And that is to think, you got to lock this kid up and never let him out, because he's going to be dangerous. This kid's a real sicko. That's why I'm recommending that people read the book. So I'm wondering if you can respond to that a little bit. Just explain, when you have children who encounter a situation like this and they end up killing family members, what's the prognosis on the mental health and the prognosis on doing it again?
These children tend to not reoffend. In fact, the recidivism rate is very, very low for these children. And that was said over and over in his hearings by multiple doctors. And same thing with anything you read on parricide. It's a cry for help. And once they get the medical condition, the brain condition, and it took a year for him to stabilize on antipsychotics and antidepressants, and then to get the therapy that he got, because he was in the juvenile system for 7 years. And so he got a good 6.5 years of treatment, therapy and medication, and also his medical needs met. And he gained half again his weight within a year or two of him. He was only 100 pounds. That's the other thing, is they didn't feed him regularly. He wasn't on any kind of schedule sleep-wise. Yeah.
So he had no sleep, he had no food, and he had almost no contact with the outside world.
Right.
So who wouldn't be a little bit nutty? And then you've got all the other things that go on when you're a teenager. And,
right.
all the hormones and the irrational thought processes. And
that was the thing that when I first went to see him, he was, and later the psychologist explained it to me. He said, because he started acting like this big time gangster when I first saw him. And, I knew the kid, I just, for Christmas, and this is like less than a month later. And what he said was that in his brain, he has to make sense of what he did. So he started acting like a big time gangster. And it was just hilarious to have conversation, but they told me not to, break his bubble, and they were treating him with antipsychotics. So we went on through the system, and I fought to get him into an adolescent treatment center. And there he was third grade in most of the subjects except reading. And he read mostly by memorizing words because, of all the Bible stuff and Bible stories his father had him. But he also went into the encyclopedias and read those. And so he was a smart young man. And within 19 months, he jumped 4 grades.
oh wow.
And so he wasn't stupid. That's what his mother called him, stupid and willful. That's what she called him, and stopped teaching him. And she didn't have a high school degree. Now, I have gotten very active with juvenile justice and gun safety laws, gun sense laws. But the one thing I haven't gotten active in is the fact that, our school system, you can just homeschool a child and you don't get checked on. They don't have to take tests. They don't have to present any kind of proof that the child is learning. And so he was very isolated. And it is a horrible thing that our state allows. And that's probably one of the things that, if I continue in this activist role, would be to get a bill that changes that. I don't have anything against homeschooling personally, because I know some very good people that would welcome presenting any kind of artifacts or that the child is learning. But in this case, they did not. And so that was sheer neglect in my mind.
That would be the first sin of the system that we've encountered, which is that homeschooling is not properly overseen in New Mexico. And
Right.
That's something that we would all want to look at in each of our states.
I believe it's true in California, if you remember the Turpin case.
In a certain sense, there's no way that your nephew could have gotten that same treatment had he not been in the juvenile system, because it couldn't have happened in his own family.
No, exactly. And that's the irony of this whole thing, is that he got a proper education. He went on to get graduate high school, and he purposely wanted to graduate from the high school that they had in the juvenile system, as opposed to a GRE or GRD. What is it?
GRE. Yeah, I think you got it right the first time.
GED. That's one.
We all know it.
And he passed what's called community classes, community school classes, and 2 vocational classes. And I gave him books all the time. He knows more about history than I'll ever know. And so it just was a real shame that it took that for him to get the attention he needed. And the Children's Youth and Family Services were called on my brother, and my brother managed to chase them away. So there were a lot of things that went wrong that led up to this. And then after, he did get the proper treatment, but he also got into the juvenile system after a plea, and was determined by a children court judge that he was salvageable, and they were going to let him out at age 21. But then it changed.
Well, before we go there, I wanted to go over what the first sin of the system. There is a first sin of the system that I want to get to, but before we go there, I want to talk about as a family. And I've observed this in families. I've observed it in churches, that the people who come along in your life, who you give birth to, or who you are a cousin to, or a sister to, or whatever, you accept them for who they are. And you don't recognize that perhaps whatever is there is dysfunctional, because it is what it is, and it's what you're used to. And right. I'm wondering if you can share anything that you might have learned in your, you had a large, happy, extended family. You regularly got together for wonderful extended family events and holidays and celebrations and holy days. And tell me what the rest of us could learn from your experience, because you didn't see the sign, you didn't know the sign.
Right. Well, I mean, what I've said, when people have asked me, what would you have done differently? I said I probably have sat on the couch in my brother's house more often. because, the change in the generations, I don't know if when you were growing up, this was true, but I spent a lot of time on my grandmother's couch, my aunt's couch, that kind of stuff, just visiting with them to know what was going on in the family. And there were signs in my brother, he talked about guns, and I kind of just like dismissed that conversation. And I didn't know how many guns he had. And I remember going over his house and him being kind of paranoid about us going up to the second floor of the house. And then, like I said, at family gathering, all the rest of the kids, like a wedding, the big dancing, and everything like that, because it's a, Spanish wedding or Hispanic wedding. And all the kids are dancing.
We do that in
floor.
Norwegian families. We dance at weddings.
Yeah. Well, the kids are wandering around with each other doing whatever, but his kids were, very controlled at the table. And then, when they came over Thanksgiving before everything happened, these children were starving, very hungry. They were, I was carving the turkey and feeding them the turkey as I was carving the turkey, and so there were signs, and it wasn't unusual that these kids were hungry. But it's like he was in the gangs before he became, born again. And he was up for life, 15 years to life for a drive-by shooting, because he was a gang leader. And so when he converted and this was in California, and he ended up converting and then coming to Albuquerque to be a pastor, we were just happy that was the case, that it would, that he wasn't in the gangs anymore. And we sort of overlooked that, wasn't a miracle, that, all of his trauma as a child, in his childhood, in his military career, and in the gangs was not just like wiped away. Clearly, guns were a big part of his life. His paranoia was big time. When we cleaned up his house, he was a hoarder, and there was no food in the house, more guns and ammunition than food, And so, I didn't know the extent of it, but I didn't probe very deeply either. Like I said, if I'd have sat on his couch more often and just, was there to listen to the dialogue and see what was happening with the children, I might have picked something up. But I mean, that's the kind of thing you do after these events. You go through your mind and say, how did this happen?
Yeah. And I know a lot of times, the reason people watch murder mysteries or even true crime stories or even this particular podcast is because they want to find a way to do it differently, and they want to make sure it doesn't happen to them. And in your case, you want to make sure it doesn't happen to other people. And you've spent your life doing that now.
Right. Right.
Every day off, and now you've retired to do more of it.
Right.
So getting, families are a system, and they're a closed system. And
Right.
So it is really difficult. Do you have any thoughts or any suggestions on if people see any of those kinds of signs in their families? So where do you go? What would you do? I can't imagine even what you would do. I can see where he was stuck.
Right. And that's one of the things I talk about in the last chapter of the book. I go through multiple systems, and you're right. Families are systems, and the extended family and church, I'm sure, saw some signs as well. And I think there should be a helpline for children, honestly, in this day where kids are isolated, where they can call and it's anonymous. I mean, I've listened to other tragic stories where a child is being abused, and then the response is for them to come up to the door and talk to the father, and that's the worst idea possible. What they should be doing is sending somebody and just checking it out see what's going on in a family. If a child texts a certain number, it's like that hotline they have for trafficking. They should have something like that for children that feel like they're trapped.
That was the very first thing that came to my mind too. So we'll believe that great minds think alike on that one. But it was the first. I thought, well, there had been a 911 number that kid could have called.
Right.
Maybe. And I shouldn't call him that kid. What is your nephew's name?
In the book, he's referred to as Ezekiel.
Ezekiel. Okay. Mm-hmm. In terms of the first sin of the system, obviously the church didn't catch it either, or perhaps they did because they discharged his father and he was unemployed for 10 months, which seemed to be the trigger for him.
Right. Right.
He had been abused as a child, which you talk about in the book, and he turned his life around and helped a lot of people in his role. He worked with prisoners, but he never got help. He never got help.
And that was the irony, is he was after he got fired, he he was about to take a job. In fact, I interacted. He's one of our representatives in the legislature with a veterans organization, and he was going to do some PTSD training himself before he was going to work with veterans on PTSD. And it was going to happen within a month of what happened. I mean, it's just one of those things where it's sad, really sad. But in terms of sins of the system, the fact that this church, and I'm not saying every church member felt this way, but a lot of these churches, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, don't believe in psychotherapy or psychology, that they think it's a cult. So when a child displays symptoms of mental illness, it's not picked up, or the child knows to repress it if he thinks they're going to, like in his case, there's demons potentially, and they were going to do some sort of exorcism or something like that.
Wow,
so
well,
that to me is a huge system. I mean, failure. The fact that his brain had a split that happened is one thing, but the fact that the way they responded to that, even the police, when they arrested him, it was clear that he had a psychotic break, and yet they kept him and interviewed him for at least a couple of hours. Two big men interviewing 100-pound man.
So he's 16 years old.
No, he's 15 when he got arrested.
And he's arrested, and he's hauled in there all by himself as a minor.
Right.
And they don't call any family members?
No. And his sister,
does he even get a call?
But I didn't get a call, and they knew my phone number because his sister had given it to him, and they didn't even call his sister into the room when they were communicating with her. He's got an older sister that was married, and she's the one that was called, but she was in the same building, and they didn't let her in the room. And she had given them my phone number, and they didn't call me. They Mirandized him. Of course, he hadn't slept in 2 days. He had just, done what he had done, and he was psychotic. I mean, like the split was going on, and they had two adults. This is 100-pound, 5'8" child, 5'7" child. I mean, it was insane to me that they didn't call us. My brother in particular, the other one that helped supported him.
How long was he in their custody before there was an adult there with him from his family or representing?
There was no adult before they put him in the detention center until I went to go see him on Monday. This happened on early morning hours on a Saturday. We found out early in the morning on Sunday, and it wasn't until Monday that one of us were able to go see him.
Oh, so almost 48 hours from the event before there was anyone there who could look after his interests.
Correct.
And to me, that sounds criminal.
It is. I think it's criminal. That's the other thing I talk about in that chapter is that there should be, the minute a child commits any serious crime, there should be immediately some sort of social worker, or because you know how we talk about police funding, it shouldn't be just for funding, in cases of, where there's somebody you need to arrest or whatever, but there should be funding for social workers or people that are trained in that venue.
As
advocates.
Yeah, right. He needed an advocate, and maybe there wouldn't. I think there may be cases where there is no family member available, or they don't know who it would be or who it should be. You could certainly have an advocate, a system advocate for that child.
But they would have to be trained. Yeah, they'd have to be trained in some to understand mental illness and trauma informed, because this child was in a deep state of trauma, obviously.
So you told us that he started to thrive in many ways, even though prison is not or juvie, as we used to call it, is not some place anybody wants to be. But for him, he was fed, he was educated, he was medicated, he was counseled, he had all the therapy that he needed, and he was in that system for 7 years. He was supposed to get out at the age of 21, which would have been 5 years. And you used a term a lot, which was, I think, amenable. Yeah,
that just means that he's receptive to treatment. He's salvageable. He's not a sociopath or psychopath. So they recognize that he was amenable to treatment, and he proved that. He jumped 4 grades in the period of 19 months. He was receptive to all of the therapy he was getting. His brain settled down with the medication. He was thriving in school. He was doing really good. And so